Hello. So in this video, I want to sort of step back from what I normally do on this channel, where I would analyze a piece of literature or drama or a performance or film or whatever it is. And I want to talk about why we read literature and how we read literature. So this is the sort of meta explanation for what I do on this channel. So I want to start with this question of why we read literature. And I'm going to use the term literature, but I'm talking very broadly here to include things like theater, film and television, performance art, anything like this. Any sort of written or composed work of art that relies on language in some way. And the same things can apply, the same principles that I'm going to apply can actually apply to visual, and the same principles that I'm going to talk through can actually apply to things like visual art and music and things like this as well, but that's not really my primary area. I'm an English scholar. So why do we read literature? Well, because it tells us who we are as human beings. Now, that's a very abstract answer. That's not necessarily super clear. So I'm going to try and sort of explain this a little bit more. What literature essentially does, in my view, is it explores what it means to be a human being in the world. We through literature, get a sense of how human beings experience themselves, how they experience their societies, or rather, I guess I should say, how we experience ourselves, how we experience our societies. We get a sense of what it means to be beings making ethical choices in the world and things like this. So this is a crucial way of understanding the human experience. And so, and that's actually the thing that brought me to literature. That's the thing that made me become an English major when I was an undergrad. Because I went into my undergrad university as a history major. I was interested in the American Civil War. And I remember this very distinctly. I was reading a book about the Army of Tennessee, and it was talking about, the numbers of different types of guns that were sent to particular regiments at different times in the war. And it was like this list of 37 Enfield rifled muskets were sent to the 14th Tennessee Infantry on October 2nd, 1863. And they got 102 Springfield rifled muskets, and they got, 2 Spencer rifles or whatever. It was just this list, and I was like, what occurred to me was that it wasn't interesting. Now, it's important, and I get that. Now, I'm not disparaging history, because I do love history, but I realized that for me, what I was interested in was not names and dates and places and logistics. What I was interested in was how people experienced themselves during the Civil War. What did it mean to people who were there? Those were the stories I was drawn to. And what occurred to me was that history as a discipline was not really oriented toward that type of study. Sometimes it is. There are a lot of fantastic history books that do tell individual stories and draw on that technique, but it's not primarily what history is intended to do. And I realized that that's what literature is intended to do. The literature is what tells us human stories. It's what helps us figure out what it means to be in the world and how we navigate this crazy thing of existence. So that was sort of what drew me to English as a discipline, to literary studies as a discipline. And I think that's why we study literature. That's why we read, is to find out about ourselves and about, and I use that term not in terms of like for me to find out about me as an individual, but for me to find out about human beings. What does it mean for all of us together? And so that's what we do. That's why we study literature. That's what the stakes are. And again, this is something that applies across the arts, I think. The arts are an exploration of humanity, the human condition, our values, our needs, our limitations, etc., etc. What it means to be in the world. So that's why we study literature. How do we actually do it? How do we make meaning out of literary texts? Or how do we approach literary texts in order to understand them? Well, there's a number of different answers to this depending on what level you're working at and what your particular purpose in approaching a piece of literature is. But basically, we approach literary texts through what's called critical reading. And that's a fairly broad term that includes a lot of different strategies. But basically, we're not just asking, when we're critically reading, we're not just asking, what does this say? We're not just asking, what's the storyline, or who are the characters, or whatever it is. We're asking, what does this mean? Why does it mean that? How does the author convey that? Things like this. We're asking deeper questions. So, one of the big questions, one of the fundamental questions for literary analysis is going to be, what does this symbolize? And so this is based on the idea that in literature, a thing stands for something else. So, let's take a very famous example. In William Shakespeare's play Othello, Othello gives Ophelia a strawberry designed handkerchief, right? He gives her that handkerchief. It's not just a handkerchief. The handkerchief stands in for something. It symbolizes something. Or, more accurately, it symbolizes multiple things. And so this is what we as literary scholars, we as critical readers want to always be aware of, is that things symbolize, and they symbolize often on multiple levels. So, what does the handkerchief symbolize? Well, it depends on the way that we're reading it. It can symbolize Othello's faith in Ophelia, because it's got this sort of magic backstory associated with it, where it was blessed and will always, like, when Othello gives it to Ophelia, as long as she has it in her possession, they will always be in love, etc., etc. So it can symbolize the bonds of love or the bonds of matrimony. It also stands in almost for a wedding ring. So, I mean, in that very sort of simple, symbolic way, it stands in for their commitment to each other. It also represents the bait in the trap, because this is the thing that Iago fixates on, and he gets his wife to steal it from Ophelia, from Desdemona. I think I said Ophelia before. It's Desdemona. Sorry. But Iago gets his wife to steal this handkerchief from Desdemona, and in that way he lays the groundwork for trapping Othello. So the handkerchief symbolizes a number of things, and we can take some of that analysis further. So for instance, the fact that Othello gives this handkerchief to Desdemona, sort of like a wedding ring, suggests in a way that he is almost marking her as his property. This is obviously not a physical brand, but in a way this is a brand that he's putting on her. Like, because the magic requires that she continually carries it with her, that it's in her possession at all times, she's always marked as a symbol of his property. And so this is a feminist analysis of this. And so this is the other component of literary studies, is that we draw on literary and critical and cultural theory. Now, English is an interesting discipline. Literary studies is an interesting discipline. I tend to characterize it as an octopus discipline, in that whenever some other discipline puts something down, we reach out and grab it. We're just tentacles all over the place. So when psychology largely moved on from Freudian psychoanalysis, English took it. When political science was like, we're not as much into Karl Marx as we once were, etc., etc. So English draws from all of these other disciplines, and there's dozens of schools of critical theory that work sometimes in competition with one another, sometimes aligning with one another, and then there are people who work at the boundaries. So you've got post-colonialism, you've got postmodernism, you've got feminism, you've got structuralism, you've got new criticism, new historicism, you've got adaptation studies, reception studies, film and television studies, and so on and so on. You've got all these disciplines, and some of them are in tension with one another. So this is one of the things that's really interesting about literary studies, is you get dramatically different readings if you start from different theoretical perspectives. And sometimes people, again, trying to work at the boundaries of those disciplines and find ways to make them function together. So, for instance, I really like psychoanalytic criticism. Freud and Lacan and people like this. It's something that shapes the way that I think about literature. But I also draw from the work of Foucault, who was very critical of psychoanalysis. Foucault basically said, Foucault, who was a postmodernist, who sort of challenged this idea that there are what are called meta-narratives, that is, overarching truths or stories that explain how society functions. Foucault was critical of this idea, although there's a degree of sort of meta-narrative to his idea about discourse creating power, but that's a separate question. Psychoanalysis traditionally has been kind of meta-narrative-y, because going back to Freud, he said this is how the mind works, and it wasn't necessarily this is how the mind works in some cases, or in these specific historical and cultural conditions, etc., etc. But Foucault's basic idea is that power and social norms are constructed by discourse, by different ways of thinking, writing, talking about whatever exists in a society. And so in that way, they're very much opposites. But there's also a sort of middle ground where you say, okay, psychoanalysis says that the mind is shaped by inherent mental structures. Foucault says that society is shaped by different power relations. But actually, these can be integrated, in that the mind can have both inherent psychological structures and can be shaped by the discourse of society. So again, I gotten a little bit off track here, but it's actually not that off track, because again, the point that I'm making here is that this is part of the way that we read literature and part of the way that we understand literature critically. is we draw from different critical lenses, different theoretical lenses. So that can be feminism and post-colonialism. That can be post-structuralism and eco-criticism. That can be reception studies and new historicism, or whatever it is. And it doesn't necessarily need to be a blending. Like I'm presenting it as though it needs to be a blending, but it doesn't. You can do just new historicist work. I mean, if you're someone like Stephen Greenblatt, for instance, who's a famous Shakespeare scholar who pioneered new historicism, that may be the thing that you're primarily famous for. You could work almost exclusively in eco-criticism and just look at the way that literature explores our relationship to the environment and how the environment shapes human experience and humans shape the environmental experience, etc., etc. But these are different lenses that we bring to the study of literature, and that's in addition, and this builds up for us this ability to read literature critically. Like we gain a deeper understanding of the meanings of literature, or the potential meanings of literature, and therefore the potential meanings of the human condition through these literary lenses. So again, this is what we're primarily going to be doing on this channel, is we will explore literature. We will try and come to terms with the human condition through critical analysis, critical readings of literature.